Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to another episode of the Markfield Institute podcast. I'm happy to say that I have with me today Dr. Haroon Bashir, who is Head of Research here at Markfield and also Associate Professor of Contemporary Islamic Thought. We're going to be discussing Dr. Haroon's new book that came out in January 2025 by Oxford University Press, entitled Slavery, Abolition and Islam. There's a lot of things in the book, which we obviously won't be able to cover, but please feel free to check the book out. But Haroon, if I were to just start off, how would you summarize the key arguments or the key themes of this book?
Look, writing the book was obviously quite a difficult task. Trying to condense everything that I wrote into a single podcast.
It's not going to happen. We're not going to be able to do that.
It's going to be slightly tough. So obviously the conversation today will be slightly elliptical to a degree. But what I'm going to try and do is provide an overview of what I cover in the book. And the book essentially explores a history of theological discourses within Islamic thought, highlighting the genealogy of conversations pertaining to slavery and emancipation, and eventually abolition when they emerge round about the late 19th century. And that's when Muslim scholarship begins to imbibe abolitionist visions and chart new directions for Islam. And that kind of leads to what I describe as Islamic abolitionism. So if I were to kind of emphasize the entry points for the book into the broader conversation about kind of Islamic thought and slavery and abolition, that would be the first point that I would make. That the fact that Islamic abolitionism even existed within academia has been somewhat disputed, right? Some claim that it didn't really exist, and I would claim it just hasn't really been excavated or acknowledged to the degree that it should have done. There's still a strong current of thought, for example, within the academy that claims that abolition was something that was, the abolition of slavery, that is, was something that Muslim nations were compelled to do. That Muslims were essentially forced to abolish slavery, and Islam didn't promote or support the abolition of slavery. Rather, Islam was a hindrance to the abolition of slavery. So that argument was famously encapsulated by thinkers like Bernard Lewis, who wrote on this topic. And I think the famous quote goes something like, "The abolition of slavery in the Muslim world would not have been possible without foreign intervention, as it was sanctified by scripture, law, and tradition." That's, of course, a really kind of inflammatory argument, a really problematic claim for a number of reasons. And of course, lots of people have critiqued Bernard Lewis for these types of polemical positionings and conceptualizations, and it's been argued that these types of narratives were ultimately there to provide justification for colonial incursions into the Muslim world. But some of the reasons why that is too simplistic and those types of simplistic prevarications are not particularly useful in these types of conversations is because scholars have noted, for example, that some of the abolitionists that Lewis and others are promoting were, in fact, deeply racist human beings, right? They had very dehumanizing views. They had very little issue with political subjugation of, for example, non-white peoples in particular instances. So to kind of promote the idea that it was just an altruistic, humanitarian impulse that led to the abolition of slavery. Again, it's a little bit simplistic. Another thing that's often overlooked is the fact that there were hundreds of slave rebellions that took place prior to the abolition of slavery throughout the 18th and 19th century. And that's something that's also not mentioned. And because of that, slavery wasn't seen as potentially a profitable institution. And that's one of the entry points into the book to a degree. What I attempt to do is highlight the fact that the articulation of abolitionist ideas existed in non-Western linguistic registers, which is to say that Muslim scholars argued for the abolition of slavery in the name of Islam, not despite the fact that they were Muslim. And therefore, what I try to do is shift away from those types of civilizational polemics and help provide a more nuanced reading of slavery and abolition. And with that, I should also add it isn't to discount British abolitionist efforts either, right? Muslim scholars themselves note that these are, positive advancements in their societies. But it is to kind of highlight that privileging particular voices and erasing others altogether tends to produce a distorted image of the past. And we can all appreciate how problematic that can be. So that's the first reason that one of the first entry points into the book is to really make the argument that Islamic abolitionism is important and challenge simplistic notions regarding the history of the world, but also specifically the history of slavery and abolition. The second entry point is really regarding how we understand Islam more broadly. How do we understand the development of theology, of law, and ethics in Islamic thought, and specifically Islam's conversation with modernity, which has wider ramifications and consequences. Simply put, abolitionist readings, the idea that scripture supports the abolition of slavery across numerous religious traditions, whether we're talking about the Quran or the Bible, these are relatively new readings of scripture. Historically speaking, whether it's the Bible or the Quran, these traditions were seen, and we'll get into this in more detail slightly later, they were seen to not necessarily promote, but certainly to regulate the practice. And at some point that changed, right? We see the closure of slave markets across the world. And with that shift globally, we also see a shift in the way that scripture is understood and interpreted. But how did we get there? How did that change rupture claims of continuity, tradition, and authority within Islamic thought more broadly? The story of how abolitionism became hegemonic, the idea that Islam supports the abolition of slavery within Islamic thought, remains generally underexplored, and that's the kind of second angle that I look at in the book. The genealogy of how this position came to be prevalent, its main protagonists and opponents, their methods and arguments, and how the marriage of Islam and abolition came to be cemented, and the degree to which it is cemented, which hopefully we'll speak about at the end, is something that I look at in the book, essentially. And that's the second reason why I think, again, the second thing I tried to cover, not simply to recount an untold aspect of history, but also to highlight the internal transformations of Islam as an evolving tradition, a tradition constantly being made and remade, fashioned and refashioned, and demonstrating how change is happening all the time, whether or not people know that to be the case. And therefore, that's the kind of second point that I tried to argue in terms of, you asked about contributions of the book and some of the main themes, that in fact, Islam is not a static, monolithic entity trapped in the past. Instead, it's constantly being developed by Islamic thinkers based on their given contexts. And that dynamic process shows that understanding what the divine wants from us is not necessarily a fixed truth, but rather something that's continuously reassessed, reviewed, and even corrected based on our evolving understandings of ethics at any given point. The idea that interpretation is kind of a living, breathing thing.
And that's not unique to slavery. I mean, obviously we've seen this in so many different issues, like whether that be political, gender, like even something as simple as voting. A dominant view perhaps a few decades ago would be that, at least in this context, like voting wouldn't be accepted. Whereas now, I mean, that's not the dominant position. So even in very recent history, you can see that. So understandably, slavery itself would also have gone through these different stages of what might have been a dominant position at one point isn't dominant and something else becomes and kind of replaces that.
Yeah, absolutely. And a kind of critical understanding of how those things come to be is very key, right, for our understandings of Islam and the tradition more broadly, recognizing that things that are commonplace today, that people consider to be
almost
take for granted, right? Yeah. Like the abolition of slavery, right? Most people consider that fixed, and they don't even know there was a conversation about it.
Like a few hundred years ago, that actually, we'll come to this. Yeah. It might not have been the case.
It might not have been, and that change was highly controversial, right? It wasn't simply a case of everyone moving in the same direction. People were strongly castigated for holding these particular views, and others challenged them. And yet, over time, you see a shift emerge. And you mentioned the case of voting. I mean, it's a good example. I remember once upon a time here in the UK, the idea that you would vote for a political party. Democracy is haram, right? That tends not to be the position anymore. Generally speaking, right?
Even, I mean, we have this with things like gender as well. Like, gender is an area where things have shifted dramatically in terms of the place of women in society, or even marital relationships, or relationships between men and women. Like, all of these things have really shifted, and not just in minority contexts, like in the UK. I mean, you see it in Muslim majority countries. So I think, a lot of people probably do take that for granted.
Yeah, I mean, another example that comes to mind is, like, if again, now it's taken for granted, but the idea of Muslims being citizens in a non-Muslim state. Yeah. Once upon a time, Darul Harb, Darul Islam.
A very strong dichotomy between these two things.
And the idea that you could be a citizen in a non-Muslim state was deemed a very controversial position. And now you've got millions of Muslims living in Europe, and no one blinks about the fact. No one's asking that question anymore regarding, can you be citizens?
So I think that is important. You're right to raise this, because especially for the context of this question of slavery, just the understanding that actually things do change and things do shift, and people do take it for granted, and maybe are not aware of the mechanisms and how we've come to maybe dominant views on certain things. And slavery is actually very pertinent.
Yeah. So, I mean, in that sense, the book is about slavery, but it's also not about slavery in terms of there's a broader conversation here about the transformations in Islamic thought
towards the abolition of
slavery, which also highlights how Islamic law and theology are kind of constantly being invoked, shaped and reshaped based on context. And that becomes a big part of the conversation, right? Because in a world in which slavery is normalized and regulated, Muslim thinkers also consider it to be normalized and regulated. And then in a world in which slavery begins to be abolished through law, you see cultural shifts also take place. And similarly, Muslim scholars because Muslim scholars are human beings that live in the world, they're impacted by that. And they also begin to shift their views regarding the eradication of the slave trade. And so what I try to do in the book is highlight how that shift occurs, especially because it's such an inflammatory thing, right? It's the practice of slavery is
because it's outlawed everywhere now.
Everywhere.
Like, nobody's advocating for slavery.
Exactly. Nobody that would be considered to kind of be within mainstream Islam.
Right. Absolutely, right?
And again, as not to belabor the point too much, but 200-300 years ago, if you had gone and asked scholars, and something I look at in the book, it wouldn't have been within their vocabulary to even talk in that way. Right. And so that's the point. That's one of the things that, again, I try to reflect on in terms of what that transformation means for the way we understand Islam and tradition and modernity and authority within these broader conversations.
Okay. So let's take a step back, because this is really interesting. Let's go all the way, like, if we take a step back, prior to modernity.
Can I just, before we move on, because I know there may be someone behind the screen just screaming at me right now, regarding just emphasizing the fact that when we're talking about slavery within Islamic contexts, it's not necessarily the same thing as the transatlantic slave trade, right? Because and I think
different forms of slavery are not necessarily the case.
So what I would say is this: as a matter of kind of historical accuracy, scholars of slavery have consistently maintained that slavery within the Islamic world differed from transatlantic experiences in very marked ways. Okay, it's worth noting this. Like, emancipation was relatively common, sometimes automatic after 7 years, such as in the Ottoman Empire. Slaves were able to own property and occasionally other slaves. Again,
that's system. How does that even make sense?
What does that even mean? If we're saying
for a slave
to own another slave, right? And it wasn't necessarily racialized in the same manner as the transatlantic context. There were instances, and there's an interesting paper called "Black Excellence and the Curse of Ham." Don't know who wrote that, but if people are interested, they can check.
I think it was written by Haroon Bashir.
But there are instances when you see these types of kind of racializations, let's say, or slavery being linked with particular groups of people. But broadly speaking, the majority of slaves within Islamic context were Asian and not African. So it wasn't necessarily racialized in the same way as people imagine it to be, in the way that it was in the transatlantic experience. And look, it's indisputable that people faced lives of exploitation, abuse, and maltreatment. But there's also surprising narratives in which slaves within the Islamic world became wealthier than their masters. They led contingents of free men as military generals. They even established ruling dynasties of their own. I mean, as one example, there's a story about Englishmen that were enslaved by Barbary pirates. And when it came time to, when the English monarch at the time, Charles II, tries to ransom essentially, he commissions an envoy to pay the ransom so they can come back to England as free people. They refuse and say, no, we'd rather remain as slaves, because at that point, I mean, scholars have noted this, there's a strange kind of meritocracy that exists in which social mobility is possible even for enslaved peoples. And they see routes to kind of becoming wealthy even as enslaved peoples, right? And we find kind of numerous examples similar to that across various dynasties, whether we're talking about Malik Ambar, an enslaved African who becomes one of the most powerful figures in India and challenges the Mughals, right? He becomes like a kingmaker. Ibrahim Pasha, an enslaved Venetian who becomes the Grand Vizier of the Ottomans. Shajar ad-Dur, a former concubine who becomes the Empress of the Mamluks. The Mamluks themselves, the entire empire.
The whole thing of Mamluk
is someone who was enslaved, right? Or Ata ibn Abi Rabah is another example. He becomes the Mufti of Makkah within the first century of Islam. And again, one of the most kind of maybe not the most quoted, but
definitely a predominant authority of
an authority, an established authority that if you're going to study tafsir, or you're going to hear the name Ata, right?
It's interesting. Sorry, just because you mention it, like a lot of Ata's views on exegesis tend to be cited as, and I don't like using the word, but sometimes the word liberal is used. But some of the views that he does have in his interpretation or his explanation of certain verses, it's an interesting question. Is it related to the fact that he'd come from a similar background?
I think so. I mean, again, it's something I kind of look at in the book, but Ata always takes positions that are very emancipatory, let's say. He's always free people as much as possible. Whenever other scholars take a kind of more conservative or strict approach, he tends towards trying to facilitate freedom as much as possible. And I think his background probably...
There's an example that I remembered in the context of Nushuz or Nashiza, and he's one of the only exegetes that says, like, a husband can also be Nashiz, not just a wife. And it's interesting that it's him who's saying that, and you don't really see that, especially in the pre-modern period, in the classical period. So,
well, I mean, there's also this whole conversation about kitaba, whether the emancipation contract
what is
for freedom.
This kitaba?
So we'll come to it later, but just quickly in the context of this conversation, kitaba is a contract by which you pay a certain sum. An enslaved person pays a certain sum to buy their freedom, essentially, and the majority of scholars consider it to be mustahab, right? It's recommended. Ata considers it to be wajib,
right? It's interesting, isn't it, because of his background?
So he considers it to be obligatory if an enslaved person asks for this freedom contract. The master is obliged to give it. I would say his role obviously impacts his views on that. But I mean, kind of coming back to the point, it's difficult. Coming back to the point, it's important to recognize that these differences existed, right? But that doesn't discount the fact that these examples are still the exception for the most part. And it's also worth noting that these types of narratives, as well as the kind of key differences between slavery across the two civilizations, were used by some to argue abolition wasn't needed, right? It simply wasn't necessary because the promotion of emancipation, the lack of racialization, the social mobility afforded to the enslaved were all cited as justifications for the continuation of the practice. They argued that, look, when slavery is practiced according to Islamic law, it's simply not immoral, and therefore, why should we get rid of this? What's the problem, right? And then the more provocative question is kind of raised from that. To what extent have those types of arguments and those types of narratives provided ideological justification for the continuation of the practice? I mean, take into consideration that Saudi Arabia allowed it to be practiced until around 62. Oman abolished it in around 1970, and Mauritania Mauritania was the last country to do so in 1981.
Very recent, if we're being honest. In the grand scheme of things, it's not that long ago.
Yeah, I mean, and then again, we're talking about legal abolition. In terms of social practice, it's argued that it remains the kind of last bastion of slavery in the world. So to what extent have those types of narratives actually hindered people achieving freedom, because there are people saying, or there are scholars arguing, that actually it's not such a bad thing, right? And so that's, again, another kind of entry point for the book in terms of the types of themes that I cover and the conversations that I have in the book.
Fantastic. So I think let's take a step back, because I think this is important. The foundational scripture of Islam is obviously the Quran. Scholars, jurists, everybody is going to go back to the Quran in order to justify whatever or to speak about anything. So how does the Quran see slavery? Does the Quran promote slavery? What are the verses that speak about slavery?
Yeah, so what I would say is that within the Quran, the subject of slavery is only treated briefly. Out of the approximately 6,600 verses in the Quran, slavery is referenced in roughly around 30, so not many at all. Some of the terminology in the Quran naturally possesses a type of polysemic potential. So certain terms like abd, or every prophet of Allah is referred to as Abdullah at a certain point. And terms like fatah, is that really referencing a slave, or could it be making reference to something else? There's disputations regarding how to translate those types of terms. However, other terms clearly address slavery. So terms like raqaba, the nape of the neck, is kind of a metaphorical reference to a slave, and milk al-yamin, right-hand possessions. These are very clearly understood as referencing.
What is this right-hand?
Right-hand possessions generally refers to concubines.
Okay.
Scholars have noted the lack of references to slavery in the Quran, certainly in strong contrast to the discussions we find in the later legal traditions. It appears to demonstrate that slavery wasn't particularly prevalent in the early Muslim community. If there was a lot of slavery, there would have been more questions about slaves. There would have been more reference to the practice in the Quranic verses. In fact, even some of the terms that are used to describe slaves in later legal discourse, such as jariya or raqiq. I mean, the term jariya, when it's used in the Quran, isn't used to reference slavery or a slave girl. Jariya in the legal tradition refers to a female slave. In the Quran, it's not the case, right? Ainun jariya obviously doesn't refer to a female slave. So the Quran doesn't use the terms in the same way. In terms of the verses that do relate to slavery, what we find is that there are a number of verses that promote the emancipation of slaves as an expiation of particular sins, or because it's a righteous act in the eyes of God. Interestingly, there are virtually no proclamations or pronouncements calling for the enslavement of the free. Now, I say virtually.
But are there any verses that could potentially be read like that? Or what's the...
Sure, I think that's a really important question. And that, by the way, becomes a kind of linchpin type of... That becomes a linchpin argument of the abolitionists, of the Muslim abolitionists, or Islamic abolitionists, I should say, because there's a strong contestation around verse Q474. Now, the verse is set in the context of a battle and reads that once you've defeated your enemies, bind them firmly, or later free them as an act of grace or by ransom until the war comes to an end. So, فَشُدُّ الْوَثَاقِ فَإِمَّا مَنَّ بَعْدْ وَإِمَّا فِدَى. So manna, free them out of grace, or fida, ransom. So it becomes really interesting because this is the only verse in the exegetical tradition that's read as justifying enslavement of captives. In the exegetical tradition, this...
but the verse itself is only talking about like in the context of war, right?
Yes. So, I mean, firstly, let's clarify that. It's only in the context of war. But what becomes really interesting is that, and again, the abolitionists kind of capitalize on this, what's the two options, right? So the only way, according to the legal tradition, the only way you can enslave people is captives through battle, right? Okay, so what does the verse say regarding captives? Well, it says, manna,
fida. Yeah.
Free them out of ransom or just out of goodwill. So where does
slavery come into this?
Where's the mention of slavery? And it's an interesting point, right? That the only verse that's understood to justify slavery still doesn't mention slavery. Where's istirqaq? Like
there is no specific, right? So how is it then used then to say, actually this?
So exegetes tend to use hadith and the seerah to expand the use of, or expand the meaning of the verse. And they say, actually, while the Quran doesn't literally say you can enslave people, that it says you can only free them out of grace or ransom captives, there's actually more than 2 options. There's 4 or 5 options, depending on the exegete. And the others include, well, you can execute your prisoners or you can enslave them. So of course, for the abolitionists, their direct recourse is to scripture. They're saying go directly back to the Quran. They're not bound, according to their methodology, by centuries of exegetical tradition, of cultural accretions, right? And nor are they necessarily bound to particular interpretations of hadith, right? They're saying we should look at the Quran and Sunnah anew. And so for someone like Sayyid Ahmad Khan, who we'll come to, he uses that exact same verse. While classical scholars are using it to say this justifies slavery, he uses the exact same verse to say, no, this is the verse that abolishes slavery, right? Because the only thing you can do to captives is free them or ransom them. So slavery isn't an option. And depending on how you feel about whether or not you're bound by classical exegesis and the madhabs, for example, impacts and determines how you kind of engage with that verse. So there's very little, even from a classical disposition, from a traditional disposition, there's very little to justify enslavement, right? Even if we accept the idea that enslavement is permissible, there's very little. But what we can say is that classical commentaries of the Quran, the classical mufassirun, did serve to embed the institution of slavery within a kind of normative model of an idealized society, which is to say that slavery isn't simply viewed or wasn't simply viewed as an unpleasant reality that was to be tolerated, but it was actively viewed as part of the divine order through which God has demonstrated his grace and favor on the prosperous, and he was testing the less fortunate with trials and tribulations. Now, again, I just want to clarify, that is not the same as arguing that freedom and manumission were not celebrated as meritorious or commendable. It's not a dismissal of the emphasis numerous scholars placed on the importance of emancipation within their work. But it is an acknowledgement that the distinction between slaves and masters was considered a legitimate hierarchical structure that in the minds of many of the classical mufassirun mirrored God's relationship with his creation. Right? The power dynamic between the slave and the master was often read directly as analogous to God's supremacy over God's dominion. And therefore, the fact that a human being could be owned, bought, and sold by another was viewed as a completely legitimate mode of transaction. As Suyuti notes, Allah has favored some of you over others, right? And so what I would say is that much of the Quranic material is read through a lens that could be described as a kind of metaphysics of hierarchy. There's a strong element of paternalism in the discourse, right? Nobody's saying exploit people. Nobody's saying humiliate people necessarily. But equally, there's no disdain or derision regarding the institution and the practice. And that's fairly consistent across all of the exegetical works that I look at in the earlier chapters when I discuss the way classical scholars have engaged with these conversations. Now, just on that point, I mean, you mentioned earlier, there are kind of minority positions articulated by someone like Atta, in which we can see kind of pro-emancipatory visions. And while they're not kind of while they don't develop into a fully fledged hermeneutic in the classical world, what they do is provide lots of ammunition and evidence for abolitionists who come back to that tradition and say, actually, there are lots of scholars promoting emancipation, which they try to then build upon. And it's also important to just contextualize some of the classical exegetes a little as well, because I mean, sometimes I'm asked about this, like, well, why didn't they condemn slavery? Slavery is obviously an evil thing. Why didn't they do more? I mean, it's worth pointing out that, for example, some of the texts I work with, Razi's Mafatih al-Ghaib, Qurtubi's Al-Jami li-Ahkam, the Tafsir of Ibn Kathir, as three. Razi is a contemporary of Genghis Khan, right? Qurtubi is born around the time the Magna Carta is being ratified in 1215. Ibn Kathir is writing while the bubonic plague is decimating half of the population of Europe. The lens through which these scholars are engaging with the Quran is naturally influenced by the worlds they occupy. And in that sense, their positions are relatively what you would expect them to be for people living at that time.
Yeah.
Now, that does raise questions for Islamic spaces today that don't teach these commentaries as historically situated, but as uniquely authoritative renditions of Islam. And there are fundamentally questions to be answered about how, quote unquote, tradition is conceptualized in those types of instances. But that seems to me to be more a question about how, or more a question about contemporary expectations of the tradition than a conversation about the tradition itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so that's the Quran and like the exegetical tradition. What about Islamic law? How did jurists understand slavery and how did jurists understand emancipation?
Yeah, so what I would say is there's far more discussions on slavery in Islamic law than there are in the tafsir traditions. And that's, as I mentioned earlier, because the Quran doesn't speak a huge amount about slavery. So again, it's not to say there aren't conversations that take place, but there's just far more in the legal texts. And again, a big part of that, again, I would argue, is because slavery isn't particularly prominent in the early Muslim community, but after Islam becomes an empire, especially after the Caliph Umar conquers the Byzantine and Sasanian empires to varying degrees, you see a huge influx of already enslaved people and also people who are enslaved. And that just radically transforms the dynamics of the types of conversations that are taking place. And there are all sorts of attempts to now establish new rulings because there's new questions that weren't there before. And these verses are then expanded to all sorts of new kind of contexts. Now, in terms of enslavement and emancipation, enslavement was legitimized within Islamic law, within particular avenues, but it was seen as legitimate. The first of these was for those who were born into slavery. So if you were born into slavery, you were considered a slave, especially if your mother was enslaved. And the second legal avenue for lawful enslavement, as I mentioned, was capture through warfare. It was accepted amongst the four schools, for example, that upon victory in a battle, the commander of the Muslims had a choice regarding the treatment of captives. They could free them out of goodwill. Again, coming back to the Quranic verse, they could free them out of ransom. They could potentially execute them, or they could enslave them. And again, the schools kind of differed regarding the preference of these options. What I will say is that in legal discussions, enslavement wasn't necessarily encouraged or discouraged. What we can see is that the fundamental principle in a lot of the legal discussions is to assert the importance of military superiority in battle. That seems to be the primary focus of the legal discussions. Again, what actually happened in history is slightly separate to kind of what scholars are talking about in text. They have their own focus. And some have kind of suggested that enslavement was a punishment for disbelief. I mean, it potentially did play a part, but what I would also argue is that legal rulings appear to demonstrate enslavement was more probably linked to being considered an enemy of the state. And the reason why I say that is it was equally forbidden to enslave non-Muslims who were citizens of the Muslim state. And that is seen as categorically forbidden. And there's also kind of conversations which I look at in which you can't sell to an enemy of the state or someone from outside of the state. However, you can sell to non-Muslims who are citizens of the Muslim state. And it's interesting. I do see some overlap here with some of the Roman discussions on kind of slavery, because you could never enslave a Roman citizen, right? But those outside of Rome were considered barbarians and they could be enslaved. So it's interesting, some of those overlaps. But in that limited sense, enslavement practices within Islamic law appear to correspond to other pre-modern slave-owning societies insofar as enslavement was reserved for those who were considered outside of the community. So someone like war captives or in other contexts, criminals. Islamic law also stipulated a number of emancipation contracts that served as avenues towards freedom. So, for example, the Tadbir contract was a promise of emancipation upon the death of the master and was established once the master perished. You'll see the term mudabbar in legal texts. The istilad contract was specifically for female slaves who gave birth to their master's child, and at that stage they were referred to as the al-Walad. And they would be freed upon the master's death, and the child would be born free in that instance. I mentioned earlier the kitaba, which was premised on a payment of a certain amount of wealth, which ultimately led to the emancipation of the muqatab. And entering into these contracts ultimately earned rights for the slave, and their legal status was vastly improved in comparison to those that didn't have that contract. For the kitaba, for example, once that contract was established, there are conversations about, okay, well, now the enslaved person can travel as far as they like because they need to be able to earn wealth to attain their freedom.
So in the book, you speak about an emancipatory ethic. What do you mean by that? What does that mean?
Yeah, so I mean, the emancipation contracts kind of speak to that slightly, but there's something else that takes place in legal text that I refer to as kind of in promoting an emancipatory ethic. And basically, there are lots of these legal rulings, fatwas essentially, that promote emancipation to the detriment of the way Islamic law usually works. And that says that they just don't quite make sense in the regular way, in the regular context of Islamic law, but they exist nonetheless, and they can be found consistently across the schools. So I'll give you an example. And I run through a host of these in the book, and so if people are interested, they can feel free to tap into them. But in Quduri, the Mukhtasar of Al-Quduri, for example, there's a particular ruling that says whoever sets his slave free in the name of Allah or the shaitan or in the name of idols, the slave is still set free.
Right, yeah.
Now, that's blasphemous. Yeah. If you do something in the name of shaitan, if you do something in the name of idols,
yeah.
I mean, you can't contract anything
in the name of shaitan. Yeah,
and yet scholars were still happy to say, okay,
that's a valid
contract, right? Yeah. The slave is still freed, even in the name of idols.
Right. Yeah. That's almost contradictory.
That's contradictory to the way Islamic law would usually work. You couldn't. I mean, as an imam, you sometimes officiate weddings, right?
Yeah. You couldn't officiate wedding in the name of
if you tried
the devil or
contract a wedding in the name of shaitan, something tells me it wouldn't work, right?
Yeah.
No one would say that's legitimate. Yeah. And yet in this context, they're willing to let that go, essentially. There are lots of others. There's a conversation about al-Walad who is given freedom upon the death of her master. So they ask in the Mughni of Ibn Qudamah, that's a question, well, what if she murders her master?
Right, yeah.
I mean, what would usually happen?
They'd be taken to court and they'd be, they'd
potentially executed.
Yeah.
And in this instance, I mean, and usually there's this understanding that, again, this is kind of legal minutiae, but if, for example, someone murders their parents because they want the will,
inheritance or something,
that inheritance is then kept from
them,
right? They wouldn't then inherit. In this instance, if the Walad murders her master, she's free.
Right. Again, a bit of a contradiction, right?
Of course, it's a contradiction. It's a wild thing to say. Also, are you giving impetus to murder your? But the interesting thing is, further on from that, there's a quite cheeky conversation in which, well, does she then pay diya? Does she then pay blood money? And some of the jurors say, yes, she pays blood money at the least. And then other scholars are saying, well, technically, while she was killing him, she was still his property, so he would be liable for the blood money for his own murder. And it comes back to that.
Seems really
strange.
Yeah.
But again, kind of consistent with the fact that enforcing emancipation seems to be a very high priority for scholars across different schools. And then another one, the one that, while that's kind of gory and bloody and quite strange, the one that really was quite startling, I would say, and again, I've shown this to a few people and they're always a bit shocked by this. Sarakhsi in his Mabsut has this particular conversation about if an enslaved Muslim claims essentially there's a child. The child is being claimed by a free non-Muslim and an enslaved Muslim.
Who is the priority, or
who should be given priority?
Right.
And Sarakhsi says that the non-Muslim, the free non-Muslim, should be given priority. And his reasoning is that if the child remains with the Muslim, the child may not obtain emancipation. But if he's entrusted to the free non-Muslim, he will become free. And perhaps, he says, perhaps Allah will guide him back to Islam. But the words he uses, the consideration of the child's freedom is given the utmost priority in regard to his rights.
That's really interesting, because then it's like there's a priority of being free as opposed to being brought up in a Muslim environment. Like that, there seems to be that priority, almost like you wouldn't expect it, right?
So in that respect, I think, yeah, absolutely. Like, I feel like if someone said that today, if someone made that argument today, I
think that would be very controversial. Yeah, it's true,
right? Someone would take them up on that.
You're not allowed. Here is that jurists who have said that.
I mean, not just a jurist.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, the titan of the Hanafi school making that argument. So the point I'm making is these types of rulings are not rare. And in the book, I demonstrate that when it comes to emancipation, fuqaha were going out of their way to facilitate emancipation. And again, that probably stems back to the fact that the Quran promotes emancipation in lots of places. Yeah. And these ideas were always, emancipation was always viewed as commendable and laudatory and a very, very positive thing. And it was these types of rulings then ultimately that the abolitionists subsequently used to justify and buttress their claims that Islam always aimed at abolition. As kind of inspiring perhaps as they may have been, it's also worth noting that emancipation was also used by the opposing side. So as one 19th century defender of slavery argued, you can't abolish slavery. Emancipation is such a positive thing. It's one of the best deeds that you can.
That avenue's almost lost, is it? Like,
essentially, if slavery, if emancipating slaves is one of the best things you can do, then abolishing slavery, you're closing the door for us to achieve these rewards. That's to say, the abolition of slavery is restricting us from doing these
meritorious
things, right? And so it was used by both groups of people, which is to say that, you know, that emancipatory ethic doesn't necessarily lead to abolition. It can, if you take it in that direction. It can also be used to say that, okay, we don't need the abolition of slavery because we promote emancipation so much. So that's why the kind of debates regarding abolition become so interesting in terms of the way the classical tradition is kind of used by different groups in different ways. Yeah. And the final point I'll make on that is that one of the important things that kind of emerges from these conversations is that the authority of classical rulings remains relatively foundational within Islamic law. And therefore, again, the defenders of slavery argue that the acceptance of slavery and the lack of censure within the classical legal tradition demonstrate that there's no issue with it. I mean, to put it very, very simply, the argument that was presented is to say that, well, if Abu Hanifa didn't get rid of it, Malik, Shafi, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, the Salaf didn't get rid of it. If they didn't abolish slavery, then you're not in a position to do so. You don't know better than them. And therefore, that's why in some circles, actually, slavery is not seen as a problematic concept, idea, practice. For some, it's something that we're not currently doing right now. But in of itself, it's not a bad thing because they never said it was a bad thing. And it was those types of arguments that ultimately that the Islamic abolitionists took on. And that's why they called for actually a reform of Islamic law, more broadly speaking, in terms of shifting that entire epistemology.
Right.
And saying, essentially arguing that the cartographies of authority needs to be reworked completely.
Okay, thank you. So what about, if we look at maybe the gender dimension of slavery, how were male and female slaves treated, and were they treated differently? And if so, how was that the case?
Yeah, I would say that, to be honest, the conversations about slavery are very gendered.
Right.
You can see a strong disparity between the way male slaves and female slaves are treated. And again, I want to kind of emphasize, we're talking about legal texts that may or may not correspond with actual reality.
Right, yeah.
But you can see stark differences. So, for example,
I think that is an important distinction to make, because a lot of the time people read legal texts and they assume this is practical legal text, whereas a lot of these legal texts are manuals, and then how that is maybe worked at a practical level, we won't be 100% sure, because so it's more of an instruction, and then a jurist or a qadi would then corresponding based on the situation and circumstance do and judge in whatever way. So.
Yeah, so essentially that's exactly the point, in terms of while these conversations may happen in a particular way in a legal text, depending on how the particular mufti chooses to interpret that, if he chooses to interpret it exactly as said, that may take the conversation in one direction. Alternatively, if you feel slightly different about that particular instance, it may be slightly different, right? But coming back to the point regarding
the
gender
dimension of this.
Yeah, I mean, like a male slave can't be married without his permission. A female slave can be married to someone without her permission.
So is that so? The master is the one.
The master in this instance can marry off his female slave.
Right. And in the legal text, the female slave doesn't have a say in this, or
I mean, that's what the suggestion is. Right. Again, in particular texts that I've looked at, there may be contradictory views, but again, I look at that in the book. The question of sexuality, and this is obviously a very controversial topic, but a female slave owner doesn't have access to the male slave's body, whereas a male slave owner can have relations with a female slave according to the classical discussions on this. The question of dress is really interesting one.
The dress is interesting as well, because it reminds me of the Quran talking about the covering for women, and kind of the predominant view is that there is different aura for slave women versus free women. And then, like, the slave women's aura is similar to what a man's aura would be, and that's like the dominant position. But
do you want to just clarify for people who aren't familiar with that?
So there's this whole discussion it comes from the Quran. There's the verse on like the aura, or what should be covered and how that's interpreted, and the predominant view is that there are separate, like the man's aura is the man's aura, but the woman's aura is based on freedom of slavery as the predominant position. And so the aura of a woman is generally a free woman is the whole body, except for the face and the hands, and then people have different views on that as well. But the aura, the most kind of dominant position is that the aura of a slave is similar to the aura of a free man, which would be maybe from the navel to the knee. So, if we're basing it on what these texts are saying, then there are Muslim women who are slaves, Muslim women who are walking around and their hair's uncovered, their chest might be uncovered and things like this. Interestingly enough, though, Ibn Hazm has very strong views on this.
Can I just on that point, before you get to Ibn Hazm, I think it's important to know as well, because some people do ask me this, well, were there Muslim slaves? I mean, as though that's kind of
because you don't assume that there were Muslim slaves, but
of course of course there were Muslim slaves, because there's conversations in the legal text about them. Well, is the aura the same as a man for a female slave when they're praying?
Absolutely. Okay, that conversation wouldn't. And by the way, these conversations of the aura are in the book of prayer.
Exactly.
So, I mean, that would only apply to Muslims in the first place.
Exactly. So there were Muslim slaves.
Absolutely.
That's worth noting. Yeah. There were Muslim slaves clearly praying. And then just there's this conversation that takes place in the Hanafi school regarding, okay, does the aura remain the same when in prayer? And there's particular positions that say, okay, it's the same as a man outside of prayer, but inside of prayer, you need to cover your chest, right? Which again,
it's interesting, because maybe a lot of people might not be aware of that.
Exactly. It does raise. Sorry to pick up again. It does raise really interesting questions regarding sartorial choices. Let's say about the way we understand dress,
absolutely,
and how and the relationship between faith and particular forms of dress, right?
It's important because we think about it,
people don't consider class. Like when we're having these types of
in the modern period, we don't think about class, whereas that was integral to the way a lot of these discussions, because we don't see slavery anymore.
Yeah, exactly.
But arguably one could see a Muslim woman walking in the street, not covering her hair, not covering her face, not covering anything, and that would be perfectly legitimate according to the interpretations. Because if that was
it was,
yeah, and yeah,
because nobody's again.
Yeah,
I mean, we'll get to this, but prior to the modern period, no one said why are they doing that. Right?
Yeah.
And that's really difficult for people to comprehend in the modern day.
In the modern period, yeah.
But again, like there's historical evidence of people traveling to... and again, we talk about kind of Orientalists and their paintings and how they distort the Middle East, etc., etc. But some of that seems to correspond with our own legal texts in terms of the fact that there were people who were dressed in a particular way.
Absolutely.
But sorry, you were about to mention Ibn Hazm.
Sorry, no, it's just something that I'd come across in my own research. How Ibn Hazm, so the four schools of law, they have this position where the dress of a slave of a female slave is the same as a man, a free man, which is a lot less than a free woman. But Ibn Hazm, he seems to take issue with this in a very strong terms, and he says actually. I don't want to go into it too much, but he actually interprets the verse and says, no, actually there is no distinction in the clothing of a free woman and a slave woman, and it's actually completely the same. And that was just the position that he had in the Zahiri school. So I found that quite interesting because that's outside of the four madhabs.
Yeah.
And that's the Zahiri position, or Ibn Hazm's position specifically.
I mean, just because it's a minority position doesn't mean it's wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, a certain geographic, like let's say in Andalusia, that wouldn't be a minority position where the Zahiri school was followed. So yeah, it's interesting to kind of know.
Because I mean, again, like we don't want to. It would be a far longer conversation, maybe a conversation for another podcast. But Muslims in the contemporary world believe that lots of Muslims in the contemporary world believe that Allah wouldn't distinguish between a free Muslim woman and an enslaved Muslim woman. That the enslaved woman wouldn't necessarily be any lesser than a free woman.
Yeah. And this is actually what Ibn Hazm says. So quite stark and explicit terms, like he finds it unbelievable that God would do that. And so he reads, because the verse doesn't actually say, it's interpreted, this whole polysemic nature of interpretation. The verse is interpreted to say that. But anyway, let's go back to what...
So no, just to kind of finish off on that point, because you raised the question of gender. Look, I think for me, it highlights the importance of... Well, firstly, it highlights the importance of female subjectivities within the interpretive process, because I think, you can see that in a lot of these conversations, the female voice is missing, and it emphasizes the need for that. I think it also raises questions about the logics that underpinned the fact that many of these things were allowed and nobody saw a problem with them, and maybe potentially the importance of redressing some of that, especially if those logics are still being employed to mediate gender relations today, right? And I think it also highlights a lot of the questions about gender need to be kind of looked at critically, because again, it seems rather simplistic to see something like that and to brush it aside and not think about how it was the case that people were okay with that and the difference in kind of context. And to put it really simply, if that aspect of the tradition was allowed, the logics that governed those rulings, to what extent are they also governing other aspects of gender relations? And again, I'm speaking to the expert in gender relations, so I haven't got to. I should, I'll leave that to you. But I think for me, I think it's important. You can't overlook the fact that there were female slaves. You can't overlook the fact that men were allowed to buy female slaves and have relations with them. And you can't overlook the sometimes symmetry between the way those relationships are discussed, again, in legal texts, right? Not reality. People are very, very different to what happened.
I'm going to ask this question because I think a lot of listeners might ask the question. In the modern period, I think that is something that perhaps people might find quite difficult to wrap their head around. Like, how can a master have, and in these legal texts, have relations with his slave? I mean, how do you maybe make sense of that? Because there is a question there. Like,
so what I would say is that I mentioned earlier the Quran barely talks about slavery. There are verses that encourage marrying enslaved women, right? And scholars see this as a kind of route to emancipation also. I would say that exists within the early Islamic movement, But what's quite interesting is by the time you get to exegetical works, there's really interesting tafsir conversations about that those particular verses that suggest that men should marry enslaved women instead of keeping them as slaves. And essentially, by the time we get to the Mufassirun, classical Mufassirun, many of them are saying, I mean, for example, Razi has this conversation where he says, I know, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, but only slightly, I know Allah says you should marry these women, but here's why you shouldn't. And he gives a list of caveats to say, this is, the slave will always have more rights than the husband, etc., right? Sorry, the master will always have more rights than the husband, and you shouldn't marry enslaved women. If you have a child with an enslaved woman, this could happen. They may move away. If the master sells the enslaved woman, then potentially then that would be a divorce, etc. And what I argue in the book is that it seems to demonstrate that whatever the context of the Quran was, by the time Islam becomes an empire, the situation is so radically different that that concept of milk al-yamin that may in the early period have been seen as a way of almost providing protection, by the time we get to the legal traditions and the tafsir traditions slightly later in history, it's seen as primarily about male enjoyment. And obviously it's a controversial topic and there's a lot to kind of dive into. We're not going to have time for all of that now, but I would argue that whatever that early kind of impetus was in that direction, to a degree, it's still it shifts somewhat. And for that reason, like I would argue that, especially in some of the legal texts, there's some very problematic ideas about ownership, about intimacy, about consent. And that's something that I think, especially as we talk about maqasid al-sharia, about ethics in Islamic law, about gender dynamics, that's something that really needs to be addressed, especially if people are being taught those types of ideas as legitimate, right? Not as something that was historically situated, not even as an aberration or as a problem, but as this is what Islam is, this is what God thinks. Oh, sorry, this is what God wants. And so that's how I would probably respond to that.
Okay, and I think we will probably look at aspects of this, but I want to talk a little bit about, we've talked about the kind of jurisprudence and kind of the classical tradition. When does things change? When do things change? You mentioned this Islamic abolitionist movement. Who are these people? Who are we referring to? Who are the key figures? What are the things that they're arguing?
Yeah. So the first thing I'd say is that the concept of Islah or Tajdeed, renewal, reform, has always existed throughout Islamic history. That idea of going back to the sources and interpreting anew is something that exists within Islam, has always existed, and the idea that human errancy is always going to kind of deviate traditions. Islam itself emerges as a way of kind of correcting adulterated traditions, or that's the way the Islamic worldview kind of functions, right? So in the 19th century, you see scholars trying to employ those same ideas. The difference between 19th century reformers and those that preceded them, so Shah Waliullah, Shawkani, Ibn Abdul Wahhab and others, was the impact of European colonization and the subsequent loss of sovereignty. Panic ensued amongst Muslim intelligentsia due to the prospect of being governed by non-Muslim rulers, as well as the technological, cultural, and epistemic challenges Europe was posing. And it's perhaps due to that the spaces which constituted the centers of European colonialist power, that's Egypt and India, they also produced the most influential and strongest revivalist currents. Coming directly into contact with colonial administrations appears to have spurred the strongest feelings of loss and subsequently the loudest calls for revival and reform. So you asked the question which scholars I'm talking about. Two of the most influential projects attempted to take on this challenge were Sayyid Ahmad Khan and Muhammad Abdu. So Sayyid Ahmad Khan from India, Abdu from Egypt. Though they never formally met, the themes within their work share similar concerns. So both scholars were calling for the reform of educational spaces and the expansion of curricula, leading to reforms in their own institutions. So Azhar and what was then the Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College, but became Aligarh University. The arguments and styles differed somewhat. Abdu was traditionally trained. He was an alim. Khan was proudly not from the scholastic class. And their educational backgrounds naturally influenced their approaches. But within their writings, there were also many overlaps. For example, they both spearheaded a call for ijtihad. They both argued for the importance of accessing the Quran without exegetical commentaries. They called for a critical approach to hadith, a promotion of scientific worldviews, and both strongly censured traditional religious authorities to varying degrees. But most importantly, they argued against slavery and called for abolition in the name of Islam. Now, their approaches differed somewhat from others who were trying to politically navigate the issue. So, for example, Ahmed Bey of Tunis was one of the first to prohibit slavery in the Muslim world in the year 1846, so before America, for example. But what he did, he used a mistreatment of slaves to argue that modern slavery wasn't abiding by the high standards of Islam when it came to this issue. And it was effective, right? That type of pragmatic political maneuvering was very effective in terms of there was no need for a civil war, as was the case in other spaces. But it didn't necessarily problematize slavery as a concept or necessarily present Islam as an anti-slavery tradition, right? You see the difference between the two. There's a difference between saying Islam is fundamentally anti-slavery, wants to get rid of slavery, abolish slavery, and there's a difference
saying that people aren't adhering to this high level
to the standards of Islam,
but you're still accepting that
the slavery as a practice, right? And so the reason why Khan and Abdu are important and quite interesting is they oppose slavery specifically from an Islamic perspective, and they contributed innovative approaches to reading scripture and tradition as decisively anti-slavery.
So what were some of the arguments that they used?
Okay, so with Khan, he's been described as kind of one of the first to really address slavery systematically within his work. He writes a text called Ibdal-e-Gulami, the refutation of slavery. Essentially, it's newspaper articles, but eventually it's collated into a book in the 1870s. And he argues, and I'm quoting him directly here, we have to be certain in our hearts that this practice was contrary to the Islamic religion and was in essence bad and unworthy, which is quite different from what others are saying at the time. And so his main thesis claimed that the Quran hadn't simply restricted slavery and provided slavery with extra rights. He argued, coming back to Q47.4, that the Quran abolished slavery in the 7th century, that the only way to enslave people was through captivity, but the Quran had stipulated that the only two avenues available with captives were to free them out of ransom or free them out of goodwill. And therefore, there were no other options allowed, right? Based on the Quran. And so what he argued was that the Prophet Muhammad actually abolished slavery in the 7th century and proclaimed that all those who were captured need to be set free. And essentially, all the verses in the Quran that refer to slavery, the 30 or so that I spoke about earlier, they were referencing previous practices of enslavement, right? But there's no call to, there's no justification to free people, to enslave people.
Yeah.
And in that regard, Khan divided the Islamic tradition between the early period, the time of the Prophet, which represented the true message of Islam, and later historical Islam that had accrued innovations and heresies and misinterpretations. It's quite interesting here. You see almost a kind of a type of, I don't know, rational Salafism almost, going back to the sources and saying we can bypass the madhabs, we can bypass tradition, although he's not as, the difference here is there's no focus on hadith in the same way. But for him, the reason for the contemporary and historical acceptance of slavery within Islam was due to these historical accretions that were cultural, right? For Khan, and again I'm quoting him, there's not a single Quranic verse, there's not a single authentic hadith that permits slavery. But for him, the problem was the ulama, right? The ulama were trying to justify slavery through their interpretations. And so because of that, his kind of worldview, it led him to reassess and reject huge amounts of the hadith traditions. Of course, within the hadith traditions, there were references to the Prophet owning slaves,
So he wouldn't even accept that in the first place.
Yeah. So for him, I mean, we can bypass those.
So it's just the Quran, and the Quran isn't even.
Yeah, but I mean, it's not to say that he rejected all of the hadith traditions, but he was particularly critical of hadith traditions he felt contradicted
The Quran.
And for him, he had already established in his mind that the Quran was anti-slavery.
Right, okay.
And so if there was anything in the hadith traditions
that seems to promote slavery, he would say that's.
Yeah, exactly. So for him, the Prophet was the highest ethical ideal. Slavery was obviously something that was evil and wrong, and therefore the Prophet would have never done it.
Right, okay.
That's essentially the conversation.
Okay. So that's Sayyid Ahmed Khan, but you also talk about Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida as well. What was their
Just
approach?
quickly before we get to Abdu and Rida, because I want to kind of highlight this, because there's probably people listening that may agree with Khan's position, may not agree with Khan's position, but it's important to note that that revisionist position of his drew heavy kind of disparagement and critique from his detractors. So because he was heavily critiquing the ulama were equally heavily critiquing him. It wasn't just one way. It was quite acrimonious. There was lots of bellicosity involved. He was accused of being a colonial puppet, a sycophant. He was trying to win over the British with his interpretations. Probably didn't help that he accepted a knighthood. But, people said he had converted to Christianity. They referred to him as Dajjal. A whole host of criticism was kind of thrown at him. What's quite interesting is some of his main contentions. The Quran is congruent with science, need to be read through kind of a scientific lens, and the abolition is in line with Islam. Interesting, lots of kind of contemporary Muslims agree with those views. But they probably don't know where they've come from. So in the book, I kind of look at some of the key works that heavily critique him.
And there's more in the book.
There's more in the book. Yeah, people are interested. They can look at the way. But it's important to recognize that some of his detractors, for them, it's quite interesting to see the way they try to justify slavery. And their position is very simple. There's an ijma on this issue. There's been an ijma on this issue, a consensus on this issue amongst Muslim scholarship for 1,000 years. There's not even a conversation about its legitimacy. And it comes back to what we were speaking about right at the beginning of the podcast, in the way that the way we understand Islam and engage with that legal tradition is constantly being kind of assessed and reassessed. And depending on which side of the argument you're on, it makes you look at that legal tradition in slightly different ways. But you can fully understand why there were scholars who were making that argument, right? So Abdu's basic argument was that, again, firstly, Abdu's quite influential in winning over the Egyptian public in terms of challenging slavery and promoting abolition. And his key argument that becomes very popular was that slavery, unlike Ahmed Khan's arguments, slavery wasn't completely abolished by the Quran in the 7th century. However, the foundations for abolition had been established due to the calls to emancipate slaves throughout scripture and the restriction of fresh enslavement within Islamic doctrine. Therefore, the abolition of slavery was attuned to the aims of Islam, the objectives of Islam. And he makes this argument that it's without a doubt that the intention of Islamic law was the fundamental eradication of slavery gradually. So ibdal al-riq, asasan bit-tadrij, so incrementally, in stages, gradually, right? And so unlike Khan, Abdu was slightly more cautious in his approach. He utilized some of those rulings that I mentioned earlier, that emancipatory ethic. He utilized that and said, no, this has always been the aim of Islam, to kind of abolish slavery. And the difference between Khan, of course, was Khan was calumniating the entire tradition and saying, no, the Quran was correct,
but everyone's kind of got it wrong.
And I've rediscovered the reality. Okay. Of course, that was, it was popular amongst certain circles, but that wasn't the position that became hegemonic in contemporary Islamic thought. Abdu's argument was that Islam was always aiming to abolish slavery, and you can see it within the legal tradition. So it's kind of a rereading of the legal tradition, because again, that's not what legal scholars themselves were saying. It's an appropriation of it in a particular way. But again, it kind of becomes an olive branch to the ulama, because what he's saying is this was always our position. This has always been the position of Islam. And essentially, that allows lots of people to be won over by his argument. And Abdu, at certain points, he praises, for example, the British for the measures they're implementing. He argues that the continuation of slavery in the Muslim world was because of political elites. It wasn't because of the fuqaha. It wasn't because of Islam as a religious tradition. It was because slave traders and political elites wanted to continue this practice, and therefore there was essentially nothing that the ulama could do about it. And that resonates with people, right? Because there's a sense in which he's also critiquing the political elites of his time, and he's also making a point, a kind of commentary about the fact that scholars feel like they can't speak out against the Ottomans at that point, who they're quite critical of. Now, unlike Abdu, I mean, his arguments are greatly popularized by his student Rashid Rida, who is, again, a very, very influential figure in contemporary Islamic thought. And while Abdu praised the Europeans, Rida is far more critical of them. He just doesn't trust the Americans or the Europeans and their calls for human equality. He critiques them and says, look, they're working out their own self-interest. How is it, on one hand, they're calling for equality and the freedom of people, while at the same time, and I quote, that the white descendants of Europeans exploit other races, they continue political slavery, they've got no issue with exploitation of non-white people, right? He highlights, for example, what's going on in India. He highlights that European colonies and the vestiges of slavery are apparent everywhere. He highlights the fact that non-white people who convert to Christianity aren't allowed to attend white churches. And therefore, he's very, very skeptical of this discourse of human equality and freedom and liberty for everyone. He's really interesting for a number of different reasons, is Rashid Rida, because, I mean, firstly, he's linked to pan-Islamism, right? Esposito said there's a direct link between someone like Rashid Rida and then Hassan al-Banna. He's also linked with Salafism. We had Rehan Ismail talking about how he's seen as a progenitor of Salafism, or the first to really use that term. Again, he goes to Saudi, he hangs around with Ibn Saud, he's around Wahhabi ulama, he's trying to sanitize some of their views to a degree and kind of bring them into the conversation. We spoke to her about the link between Albani and the Manar, for example. But also aspects of his work that people aren't familiar with. He translates the works of Gandhi into Arabic.
Okay, I didn't know.
Yeah, he visits Deoband. He goes on a trip to Deoband and visits Deoband as well. So he's a very, very interesting guy because he's also fundamentally a modernist. Abdu's a modernist, right?
Yeah.
And he promotes Abdu's idea about the abolition of slavery, for example. So he's quite complex, a quite dynamic and complex figure. And I won't announce anything yet, but there'll be some things about Rashid Rida coming out of Markfield soon. Okay. Yeah. So there is a key question regarding this kind of gradualist method of Abdu and Rida, right? And a key question that emerges from this is essentially, where did it go wrong? If there was initially an abolitionist spirit promoted by the fuqaha, promoted by Islam, and then that was subverted because obviously the abolition of slavery didn't ever occur in the Muslim world up until their period. Well, where did it go wrong? And that's where Rida makes a very interesting move. And he links the demise of the true Islamic spirit to the Umayyads and to Muawiyah in particular. Now, that becomes a very common idea in lots of contemporary Islamic discourses, that the Umayyads were the moment where things go wrong, and that's how you differentiate between the Khulafa Rashidun and the Umayyads more broadly. Again, that is popularized by someone like Rashid Rida, but also people like Maududi do similar things. But that's no way a universally held position, right? Muawiyah is a companion. Someone like Yazid is part of the Salaf. The idea that they are being critiqued as a kind of subversion of true Islam actually becomes a very contentious point. And it kind of demonstrates the way in which some of these pan-Islamist thinkers, they break away from kind of classical Sunni thought on this particular issue. Again, if you go to certain parts of Jordan or Syria, the idea that Bani Umayyah or the Umayyads were a kind of subversion, or the moment it goes wrong, would be heavily pushed back on, Abdul Malik bin Marwan. You've got the Dome of the Rock. You've got Andalusia. These are seen as the high points of Islam, not necessarily the moments where things go wrong. So it's just an interesting point. regarding kind of the shifts that take place hermeneutically at this point, and how those then kind of feed into contemporary Islamic discourses about that early period. But just to kind of summarize then, Abdu and Rida's argument claimed that the rulings found within the Quran and Hadith, which subsequently informed Islamic law, espoused an emancipatory ethic, and therefore it had always been the purpose of Islam to eradicate slavery from the world. Through the restriction of acquiring new slaves and the emphasis on emancipating those already enslaved, slavery would have been eradicated within a few generations. And the reason that hadn't been accomplished was the misuse of the law by political elites, specifically the Umayyads in this context. And while it was completely legitimate to criticize their actions, Islam couldn't be accused of tolerating slavery. And that was essentially the point that was made. And just quickly, again, just like with Sayyid Ahmad Khan, Abdu and Rida were heavily critiqued. They were lambasted by scholars who said, again, similar types of argument. There's never been a question mark about this. Why is this even being raised? The rich and the poor kind of benefit one another in certain ways. Slaves and their masters benefit each other in certain ways. There's a text written by Yusuf al-Nabahani. And again, it's not even the argument that this is the lesser of two evils. The argument made is kind of quite confidently in favor of slavery, is to say that this is fundamentally a good thing for society. And again, like people today are not familiar with that type of language. They'd be quite shocked, but it fundamentally existed at the start of the 20th century. And it's kind of worth noting that those types of arguments were being made from within the Islamic tradition.
Okay, great. No, thank you, Haroon. That's been really interesting. Just to kind of wrap things up a little bit, we've spoken about slavery and abolition and actually Islamic thought in general. So just to kind of wrap things up, what does this mean for the future, or more specifically, the direction of Islamic thought specifically, and what's your views and the direction that might take?
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. Look, I think that the fact that 200 years ago, slavery was viewed as legitimate by not just Muslim scholars, I should add, by Christian scholars, by Jewish scholars, by scholars of all persuasions, and today people find it abhorrent, is an interesting development in the way that we think about the way religious traditions evolve and are constantly evolving and will keep evolving. Today, Abdu and Rida's argument has become hegemonic in contemporary Islamic thought. I mean, essentially, wherever you look,
people are adopting
that argument. That you will see it in virtually every academic work. You will see it in blog posts, popular discourses, podcasts.
Yes,
and most people don't know where it came from. They just assume it's always been there. But such is the case with so many of our contemporary discourses. People assume that they've always kind of been universally held. And often they're reflections of the societies that they've been established within. Ultimately, it seems quite kind of prosaic and simple in terms of accepting the fact that scholars and thinkers are shaped by their environments. In the classical world in which slavery was normalized, Muslim scholars accepted the legitimacy of slavery. Throughout the 19th century, groups of Muslim scholars began to promote, as I mentioned, Islamic abolitionism. As the orthodox, quote-unquote, tradition was developed in a period in which slavery was normalized, then orthodoxy has remnants of that time in which it was crystallized. And as many of these kind of abolitionist readings developed in a period in which abolition was normalized, they naturally represent the sensibilities that were current while they were being constructed, right? And therefore, they're attuned to an abolitionist outlook. You asked about the future of these types of conversations and what it means for religious interpretation. I'll give you a concrete example of that. In Surah Al-Balad, there's a famous verse that everybody quotes in regard to slavery, right? وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الْعَقَبَةُ فَقُوا رَقَبَةً. The Quran talks about people avert themselves from the steep path. What is the steep path? Is the freeing of the slave. If you look at classical tafsir on that verse, they all understood it to mean freeing of a particular slave, a believing slave, right? Abdu and Rida come along and they refer to that as, no, this verse actually means the complete eradication of slavery. It's an innovative reading. It's the first time people are really making this argument. it's also not the final reading, right? There's currently 50 million people, that's 50 million people who are in situations of modern slavery today. In a post-abolition world, in a world where slavery is not legally accepted anymore, perhaps now new Muslim theologians will step forward and transform its meaning once again to challenge contemporary forms of oppression and continue to expand Islamic thought towards new horizons and take on new challenges. And for me, it demonstrates that Islam isn't kind of situated in an unchangeable past, but these interpretive potentialities have always existed and will continue to exist. And the quest to understand the divine will is an ongoing journey. We're constantly going to reassess it. We're constantly going to refine it through our own ethical lens. And that's the way it's always been, and the only way it could ever really be. But what it does is it opens up vast possibilities for Islamic thought to address modern issues with relevance and with depth. And I suppose, in a sense, what I would finish with then on that point is to say that in terms of the future, we have these emancipatory discourses within our tradition, but simply highlighting that people used to promote emancipation or they used to promote abolition does nothing for the 50 million people in situations of modern day slavery today, those that are being exploited. And it certainly doesn't help that people are trying to justify enslavement or trying to minimize the harms of slavery. If we believe in an emancipatory tradition, if we believe Islam is a liberatory tradition, then it's obligatory upon us to prove that. And therefore, establishing that emancipatory ethic in our context may look different to what it looked like in the past. At one point, it looked like abolishing slavery. At one point, it may have looked like just emancipating people. But as new challenges emerge, new interpretations are naturally going to emerge to combat them. I close with the famous words of the companion Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who stated, "Ma ra'a al-Muslimun hasanan, fa inda Allahi hasan." That whatever the believers deem to be good is good with Allah.